instructor should allow them to relate this experience briefly, but should not make it the main factor in the soul's journey to God. The effects God desires to produce through these passive communications will be fixed in the soul without its having need for efforts of its own. As it seems to me, there is no reason then for a discussion of the different effects caused by true and false knowledge, for this would be wearisome and unending. It is sufficient to insist upon the rejection of all this knowledge as a control against any error." End quote. A final example. In his teaching, John gives a central role to the person of Jesus Christ. In discouraging persons from seeking special knowledge and revelations from God, he writes, quote, "God would respond to these desires for special knowledge as follows. Fasten your eyes on Christ alone, because in him I have spoken and revealed all, and in him you will discover even more than you ask for and desire. You are making an appeal for locutions and revelations that are incomplete, but if you turn your eyes to him, you will find them complete. For Jesus is my entire locution and response, vision and revelation, which I have already spoken, answered, manifested, and revealed to you by giving him to you as brother, companion, master, ransom, and reward. Since that day when I descended upon him with my Spirit on Mount Tabor, proclaiming, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, hear him,' I have relinquished these methods of answering and teaching and presented them to him. Hear him, because I have no more faith to reveal, nor truths to manifest." End quote. There are many ways Christians attempt to hear Jesus. In Lectio Divina, we reflect prayerfully on his words in the New Testament to deepen our love for Jesus. In the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, we imagine ourselves interacting with the historical Christ in order to deepen our commitment to following him. What of the knowledge that comes from these traditional and valued methods of prayer? Certainly, John does not expect us to reject this knowledge. Rather, he would only remind us that ultimately Jesus, too, is an incomprehensible mystery. He, too, is far more than we can ever contain within our intellects, and we must be prepared to leave our present understandings of Jesus behind as more of his fullness is revealed to us. For example, St. Paul's knowledge of Jesus evolved after his conversion from a fairly literal understanding of the historical person of Jesus to an understanding of Jesus as risen and identified with all who believe in him, his mystical body. And so the journey in faith demands that we be prepared to let go of present understandings of Jesus for a continually unfolding understanding of the mystery of his person until we see him finally on the day we die. For myself, I've had some personal experiences of this as I look back over my life. I remember early having a very kind of Christmas card image of Jesus. And what happened to that image when I visited the Holy Land for the first time and saw the stark reality of the Holy Land, the reality of Nazareth, Bethlehem, the history and the geography of all of that, made it very hard to continue to maintain the Christmas card image of Jesus. It became more real, more historical. As I look back again on my own relationship to Jesus, I can remember very much being taken by the historical Jesus, but realizing that as my life develops, Jesus becomes more identified with his people. An experience I had one time when I was in Ireland, I remember praying very fervently before the Blessed Sacrament and being aware of Jesus' presence there sacramentally, and leaving that with great fervor, came upon a situation where a Irish tinker lady was at the back door of the monastery asking for a handout. And remember becoming quite upset and infuriated with her for interrupting our privacy and disturbing the calmness of our life. And then, realizing the incongruity of that, the calm before the Eucharist, and then the upset in the presence of one of God's people. And that, again, was helping to understand that the Lord was as much in the tinker lady as in the Eucharist, and there is that need to be continually aware of how the Lord is present, not only sacramentally in the Eucharist, but in His people and in many other ways that may be revealed to me. So this is the kind of thing that I think we see here, that Jesus' teaching on the voiding of the intellect is not meant to undermine our other ways of knowing God, but rather to bring them to a deepening of faith in one who is ultimately transcendent and beyond all human concepts, images, and experience. For it is faith and not knowledge that is the primary means to union with God. And to do this, John proposes the following method, which, while it concerns directly images in the memory, applies equally to the concepts of the intellect. He writes, "As often as distinct ideas, forms, and images occur to a person, one should immediately, without resting in them, turn to God with loving affection, in emptiness of everything rememberable. One should not think or look upon these things for a longer time than is sufficient for the understanding and fulfillment of one's obligations, if they refer to this. And one should consider these ideas without becoming attached or seeking gratification in them, lest they leave their effects in the soul. Thus one is not required to cease recalling and thinking about one must do and know, for since one is not attached to the possession of these thoughts, one will not be harmed." End quote. And as an afterthought to describing this practice, John, to defend himself from the possible charge of quietism or iconoclasm, wrote, "It must be noted here that by our doctrine we are not in agreement, nor do we desire to be, with that of those pestiferous men who have sought to remove from the eyes of the faithful the holy and necessary use and the renowned cult of images of God and His saints. Our doctrine is far different from theirs. We are not asserting, as they do, that there be no images or veneration of them. We are explaining the difference between images and God." End quote. And here precisely is John's point. The thought of God or an image of God is not God. St. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, distinguished between what he called the res and the enunciabile, the reality itself and what is said about the reality. And he realized that what he wrote about God in his theology was far from expressing adequately who God really is. And as is well known, he finally gave up writing theology because he realized what he had written was so much straw compared to the God he experienced in faith. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, an orange. Think about it. Its size, its shape, its color, its smell. And now take a bite out of it. Chew it. And swallow it. You can't do it because your image is not the reality. Just as John says, the image of God is different from the reality of God. On the other hand, I can try to describe everything possible about what an orange tastes like, but you will come to know more about its taste by one bite than I can tell you in a lifetime of verbal descriptions. And this also is true with God. We discover more of God through direct experience of God in faith than through a lifetime of reading theology, if that reading does not move us to simple faith. Francis de Sales believed that many housewives know more of God in their faith than learned theologians through their books. And likewise, John of the Cross, writing to his friend, the Carmelite nun Anne of Jesus, said, "Even though you lack training in scholastic theology, by which divine truths are understood, you are not wanting in mystical theology, which is known through love, and by which one not only knows, but at the same time experiences." End quote. While John of the Cross maintains that human understanding is limited in its ability to actively form adequate concepts of God, he also teaches that it is virtually unlimited in its capacity to receive knowledge of God passively. Commenting on the words "deep caverns of feeling" in his poem, "The Living Flame of Love," John writes, "These caverns are the soul's faculties, memory, intellect, and will. They are as deep as the boundless goods of which they are capable of, since anything less than the infinite fails to fill them. The capacities of these caverns is deep, because the object of this capacity, namely God, is profound and infinite." End quote. The knowledge of God which these faculties are capable of receiving is the knowledge of God in contemplation, not clear and distinct ideas about God, but rather God's own general loving knowledge. And this loving knowledge which God communicates to persons disposed to receive it transforms their human faculties, enabling them to know and love as God knows and loves, with God's own knowledge and love. And John describes the practical effects of this contemplative loving knowledge when he writes, "God now possesses the intellect, the memory, and the will as their complete Lord, because of their transformation in him. And consequently, it is he who divinely moves and commands them according to his spirit and will. As a result, the operations are not different from those of God, but those the soul performs are of God and are divine operations. Since the one who is united with God is one spirit with God, as St. Paul says, the operations of the soul united with God are of the divine spirit and divine. These persons consequently perform only fitting and reasonable works, and none that are not so. For God's Spirit makes them know what must be known and ignore what must be ignored, remember what ought to be remembered, with or without forms, and forget what ought to be forgotten, and makes them love what ought to be loved, and keeps them from loving what is not in God. Accordingly, all of the first movements of these faculties, the intellect, the memory, and the will, are divine. It is no wonder that the movements and operations of these faculties are divine, for they are transformed in divine being." So how does Vipassana practice, then, fit into this process of becoming empty for God? By now you all probably have had enough experience with the practice to guess the answer. Vipassana provides a meditative method which helps us to let go of attachments to concepts, understandings, feelings, images, opinions, experiences, emotions, memories, desires, pleasures, in short, anything that might be an obstacle to our journeying in faith to a union of likeness with God, or receiving the transforming knowledge and love of God in contemplation. In the Ascent of Mount Carmel and in its companion book, The Dark Night, John demonstrates that 3 purifications are necessary for coming to divine union quickly. The first is the mortification of disordered desires, which purifies the sensory self, and this he describes in Book 1 of the Ascent. The second is the emptying of the intellect, the memory, and the will in active faith, hope, and love, which purifies the spiritual self, and which he describes in the second and third book of the Ascent of Mount Carmel. And finally, God's loving self-communication and contemplation, which purifies the person at the very deepest level of being, what John calls in the very substance of the person's soul, and therefore transforms the entire person in God, which John describes in the whole book of the Dark Night. These three purifications, which John describes, parallel in a very general way the three purifications identified in Buddhism, which are necessary before a person arrives at Nibbana, the unconditioned, limitless reality which is the goal of Buddhist practice. These three purifications are the purification of conduct, especially through generosity, the purification of mind and heart, especially through meditative practice, and the purification of all consciousness, especially by insight and intuitive wisdom. Thus, in this practice, as you work with desires, with body sensations, with mind states, as you work at non-attachment toward persons, places, and things and their images, as you concentrate on being only in the present moment, accepting without judgment all that you are experiencing, you are, in effect, emptying yourself for God and disposing yourself for God's transforming action in your life. You are, as St. John of the Cross might put it today, on the fast track that leads toward divine union. And it may be of some small consolation for you to know that, spiritually speaking, this is life in the fast lane. It is a practice that disposes you to experience what John of the Cross describes in Book 2 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel. Quote, "When persons have finished purifying and voiding themselves of all forms and apprehensible images, they will abide in pure and simple light and be perfectly transformed into it. This light is never lacking to persons, but because of creature forms and veils weighing upon and covering them, the light is never infused. If persons will eliminate these impediments and veils and live in pure nakedness and purity of spirit, their souls, in their simplicity and purity, will be immediately transformed into pure and simple wisdom, the Son of God. As soon as natural things are driven out of the enamored soul, the divine are naturally and supernaturally infused, since there can be no void in nature." End quote. Thus, in the very process of emptying ourselves for God, God draws us to himself in an ever-deepening union of likeness centered in divine love. We still have some time left if you have any questions or observations or any... Yes?
It seems to me that there are some parallels that can be made, and you made them very well, and they have been made in other evenings, between the mystical life of John of the Cross and the goals and teachings of Buddhism. But it also seems to me that John doesn't provide in his writing a detailed step-by-step method. It's more generalized. Exactly what the methods aren't in the books themselves, and they're just kind of clues to spiritual directors to not screw people up when they come in with certain kinds of information and experiences, and to give them a right direction. And so I think that what we have is that the goodness of the Buddhist practice itself has been manifest for thousands of years in the good lives of good people. And we can feel confident to enter those practices because they've already shown the fruit that they can bear. I think it's important that Christians feel confident, and therefore that they're not being led some path that would be antithetical to the gospel. But I think we all should feel confident that you know a tree by its fruit, and this fruit has been around the time that we enjoyed it.
I think you all heard what you said, and I won't. It's more an observation, I think, than a question.
Right. I just don't feel like we always have to be apologetic that we're dipping into some foreign religion and screwing people up.
Yeah.
We could actually point to the religion and show its goodness.
Right.
Because it has, in fact, done and been so good.
Right.
That we don't. It's something like Justin Martyr said. The Logos has spread his seeds of truth everywhere, and it's for us to gather up the fruits of it.
Right. Right. Yes, and I think particularly the point that you made early in your comment is that you can see very close parallels between Buddhism and John of the Cross. As a matter of fact, John of the Cross is popularly called a Christian-Buddhist. In his writings is very popular with Buddhists because they can so easily recognize what he's talking about, particularly like when he's talking about the emptying of the intellect and memory and the will. And it is true, even though John is talking about transformation really through prayer, by which he means meditation and contemplation, he doesn't give you a lot about the practice of meditation. Probably 10 or 12 pages is about all he has in there, and that's not much. So when you ask yourself the question, where does one find a practice by which to put into practice the kind of self-emptying that he says is necessary to dispose oneself for union with God? You don't find it in him other than in general principles. But that's I would say, probably the miracle of God's revelation to all of his people through culture, through world religions, that here you find, and it's just, to me, it's a marvel of God's providence, a practice that has been developed, over centuries, that seems to answer that particular need perfectly. And it's interesting. Mary Jo made the point this afternoon in talking about what this practice is geared to. It's geared toward purification. And that's exactly what John of the Cross is writing about in The Ascent in the Dark Night, is how we purify, or how we are purified in order to be made ready for divine union. It's just, the parallels are just amazing. So I think that what you say is very true, and in the actual practice of bringing these traditions together, I do think we have to do it with a certain sensitivity to the similarities and the differences, and explain them in a way that people can see that as they adapt the practices, for example, the meditative practice, they're not relinquishing, say, their faith in Christ, or even they're looking to John of the Cross as a spiritual guide. And I think that's probably the challenge that's ahead of us, say, in the next generation of the dialogue between, the Christian-Buddhist dialogue for certain, and the dialogue between religions, and will continue the smaller the world gets and the more we're interacting with one another, that we will be learning from each other.
Well, certain Buddhist traditions are going to have to face what Christians have faced in terms of historical research into just what was the historical Buddha about, really. And there's a lot of mythology that has developed around Buddhism that in many ways just isn't supported by the historical data, whereas the historical data is I think Christians are going to be quite excited by it.
Yes. We have some exciting days ahead.